The Millbrook Express, A Day Trip to Remember. Read by Chuck Brown. Sarah pressed her nose against the cool window of the train car, watching the suburban landscape gradually give way to rolling hills dotted with patches of morning mist. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on track had already begun its hypnotic work, and she felt her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Look," she whispered to David, who was settling into the seat beside her with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the dining car. "You can actually see the fog lifting off those fields." David handed her the coffee, cream, no sugar, just how she liked it, and followed her gaze. The early morning sun was painting everything in soft golds and pale greens, and the mist seemed to dance above the earth like something from a fairy tale. "I'm so glad we decided to do this," he said, his voice still carrying the contentment of someone who had slept well and awakened without an alarm. "When was the last time we took a trip without checking our phones every 5 minutes?" Sarah smiled, pulling her weekend bag closer and retrieving a small notebook she'd brought along. "I can't even remember, but I have a good feeling about Millbrook. The woman at the information desk made it sound like the kind of place where time moves differently." The Millbrook Express was a heritage line that ran weekend service between the city and the small town of Millbrook, nestled in a valley about 2 hours north. Sarah had discovered it quite by accident while researching weekend getaways, drawn by the promise of a town that still hosted a Saturday farmers market, boasted a working grist mill, and was surrounded by walking trails that led to hidden waterfalls. As the train curved through a particularly scenic stretch of countryside, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be approaching Millbrook Station in approximately 30 minutes. For those visiting for the first time, I'd recommend starting your day at Maple Street Cafe. They serve the best blueberry pancakes in 3 counties. The town's farmers market runs until 2 o'clock, and don't miss the old mill demonstration at 11 and 3. David pulled out the small map they'd picked up at the station. "It looks like everything's within walking distance. The mill, the market, that little museum you mentioned. The Heritage House," Sarah nodded, reading from her notebook. "It's supposed to have a beautiful garden and a collection of quilts made by local women over the past century. And there's supposed to be a trail that starts right behind it." The train began to slow, and through the windows they could see the first signs of Millbrook, a covered bridge spanning a creek, a red barn with a weathered advertisement for seed corn painted on its side, and then the neat rows of maple trees that gave the town's main street its name. Millbrook Station was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, a small restored building painted in cheerful yellow with white trim, flower boxes overflowing with late summer blooms, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 1,847. As they stepped onto the platform, the first thing that struck them was the quiet. Not the empty quiet of a place where nothing happens, but the full quiet of a place where birds sing, leaves rustle, and somewhere in the distance, church bells mark the hour. "It smells like," David paused, breathing deeply. "Like wood smoke and apples," Sarah finished, shouldering her bag. "And maybe cinnamon?" They made their way down the platform, past a small group of other day trippers, families with 2 young children who were already excitedly pointing at everything, and an elderly couple who moved with the unhurried pace of people who knew there was nowhere else they'd rather be. The walk into town took them down a tree-lined street where the houses seemed to grow more charming with each step. Victorian cottages sat beside simple farmhouses, their yards filled with the kind of gardens that spoke of decades of patient tending. Hollyhocks leaned against picket fences, and vegetable gardens displayed the abundance of late summer, tomatoes heavy on their vines, squash sprawling across neat rows, and sunflowers turning their faces toward the morning sun. There, David pointed ahead to where a cheerful red and white striped awning announced Maple Street Cafe. The conductor wasn't wrong about it being easy to find. The cafe was the kind of place Sarah had dreamed about, but rarely encountered in real life. Mismatched tables and chairs created cozy conversation nooks. Local artwork covered the walls, and the blackboard menu promised not just blueberry pancakes, but also farm-fresh eggs, maple sausage, and coffee roasted right there in town. They found a table by the window, where they could watch the town come to life. A woman in overalls was setting up a flower stand across the street, arranging bouquets of zinnias and marigolds in old galvanized buckets. A man who was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store, pausing to chat with everyone who passed by. "This is already perfect," Sarah said, opening her notebook to jot down impressions. "Look at how the light hits those buildings. And did you notice how everyone seems to know everyone else?" Their server, a young woman with flour-dusted apron and a genuine smile, brought them coffee in thick ceramic mugs. "First time in Millbrook?" she asked, and when they nodded, her face lit up. "Oh, you picked a perfect day. It's Harvest Festival weekend, so there's extra vendors at the market, and Mrs. Henderson is demonstrating traditional corn husk doll making at the Heritage House this afternoon." The blueberry pancakes, when they arrived, were everything the conductor had promised. Fluffy and golden, studded with berries that burst with sweetness, and served with maple syrup that tasted like it had been tapped from trees that very morning. The farm-fresh eggs had deep golden yolks, and the maple sausage carried just a hint of sweetness that complemented the savory herbs. "I think I could eat like this every morning," David said, taking another bite of pancake. Sarah nodded, already planning to ask for the recipe. This is what breakfast should be. Not grabbed on the run, not eaten while checking emails, but this, with time to actually taste it. After breakfast, they made their way to the farmers' market, following the gentle crowd that seemed to be moving in the same direction. The market was set up in town square, centered around a gazebo that looked like it had been standing there since the town was founded. White tents created neat rows, and the air was filled with the mingled scents of fresh bread, ripe tomatoes, and the last flowers of summer. The vendors were clearly locals, many of them probably descendants of the families who had founded the town. At the first booth, an elderly man with weathered hands was selling vegetables that looked like they'd been pulled from the earth that very morning. His tomatoes were still warm from the sun, and his corn still had silk clinging to the husks. "These are beautiful," Sarah said, selecting a few tomatoes. "Do you grow everything yourself?" "Been farming the same land for 43 years, he said with pride. "My grandfather started the farm, and my son's learning the trade now. That corn there? We planted it by the old almanac, just like Granddad taught me." At the next booth, a woman was selling preserves and honey, the jars arranged like jewels catching the morning light. She offered samples on small wooden spoons, strawberry jam that tasted like summer, apple butter rich with cinnamon, and honey so pure and golden it seemed to glow. "The bees work the wildflower meadows up on Mill Ridge," she explained, as Sarah and David tasted the honey. "Different flowers bloom at different times, so the honey changes throughout the season. This batch has a lot of clover and basswood." David bought a jar of the honey and another of the apple butter, while Sarah was drawn to a booth where a young woman was selling hand-woven scarves and shawls. The colors were inspired by the local landscape, the deep green of pine forests, the golden yellow of wheat fields, the soft blue of the creek that ran through town. "I dye them with plants I gather myself," the weaver explained, running her fingers through a scarf the color of autumn leaves. "This one is from maple leaves and walnut hulls. The blue one is from indigo I grow in my garden." As they wandered through the market, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in months. There was something about the unhurried pace, the genuine interactions, the connection to the land and the seasons that felt deeply restorative. She bought a small bouquet of late summer flowers, black-eyed Susans and purple asters, just because they made her smile. "Look at this," David called from a booth where a man was demonstrating traditional woodworking. He was carving a spoon from a piece of maple, his knife moving with practiced precision. Shavings curled away from the wood, releasing the sweet scent of the tree. "Each piece of wood has its own personality," the craftsman explained, not pausing in his work. "You have to listen to it, work with the grain, not against it. This spoon will probably take me about 2 hours to complete, but it'll last for generations if it's cared for." They watched, mesmerized, as the spoon took shape. There was something deeply satisfying about watching something useful and beautiful emerge from raw material, shaped by skilled hands and patience. When the town clock chimed 11, they made their way to the old mill, following a path that led down to the creek. The mill was a 3-story structure built of local stone, its wooden water wheel turning slowly in the current. The sound of water flowing over the wheel and through the old mechanisms was hypnotic, a rhythm that seemed to match the peaceful pace of the town. The miller, a man in his 60s with flour permanently embedded under his fingernails, explained how the mill had been operating continuously for over a century and a half. "Water power," he said, gesturing toward the wheel. "Reliable, renewable, and it gives the flour a different texture than modern mills. We still grind corn and wheat the old way, between stones that were quarried right here in the valley." Inside the mill, the air was thick with the scent of grain and the sound of grinding stones. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the windows, and the wooden floors creaked pleasantly under their feet. The miller showed them the massive stones, weighing several tons each, that ground the grain into flour. "Feel this," he said, offering them a handful of freshly ground flour. It was warm and fine, with a slightly nutty scent that bore no resemblance to the processed flour they were used to. "This is wheat that was harvested last month from fields just outside town. From seed to flour, it never traveled more than 5 miles." They bought a bag of the fresh flour, along with some stone-ground cornmeal, already imagining the bread they would bake at home. The miller wrapped their purchases in brown paper, sealing them with wax and a hand-stamped symbol that read, "Millbrook Mill, established 1873. After the mill demonstration, they found a bench by the creek and unpacked the lunch they'd assembled from the market. Fresh bread, local cheese, the tomatoes they'd bought earlier, and some peaches that were so ripe they had to be eaten immediately or not at all. The creek gurgled softly beside them, and dragonflies skimmed the surface of the water. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting with infinite patience for an unwary fish. The sound of the mill wheel continued its gentle rhythm, and somewhere upstream, a kingfisher rattled its distinctive call. "This is exactly what I needed," Sarah said, biting into a peach and catching the juice with her free hand. "I didn't even realize how wound up I was until I started to relax." David nodded, watching the heron. "It's like we've stepped into a different world, or maybe a different time. Everything feels real here, connected." After lunch, they walked up the hill to the Heritage House, a beautifully preserved Victorian mansion that had been converted into a museum and cultural center. The house was painted in soft yellow with white gingerbread trim, and the wraparound porch was lined with rocking chairs that invited visitors to sit and watch the world go by. The garden behind the house was a masterpiece of traditional design. Neat beds of herbs and vegetables, flower borders that bloomed in carefully planned succession, and fruit trees that had been trained into espaliers along the sunny walls. A docent, a woman in her 70s who had clearly been gardening for decades, was happy to explain the plantings. "This is a heritage garden," she said, leading them along gravel paths between the beds. "Everything here is from seeds that would have been available to the original owners of the house. These tomatoes are Cherokee Purples. These beans are Cherokee Trail of Tears, varieties that have been passed down through generations of gardeners." She showed them the herb garden, where medicinal and culinary plants grew side by side. Comfrey for healing, lavender for calming, sage for cleansing. The original garden would have been the family's pharmacy as well as their source of food. Inside the house, the quilt collection was extraordinary. Dozens of quilts made by local women over the past century and a half, each one a work of art that also told a story. Wedding quilts, baby quilts, quilts made from scraps of worn-out clothing, quilts that commemorated important events in the community's history. "This one," the docent explained, showing them a quilt with an intricate star pattern, was made by a group of women during the Great Depression. They met every Wednesday evening to work on it together, and it took them 3 years to complete. It was raffled off to raise money for the church roof. In the corner of the main room, Mrs. Henderson was demonstrating the traditional craft of making corn husk dolls, her weathered hands moving with practiced skill as she transformed dried corn husks into charming folk art figures. "Corn husk dolls were made by children and mothers for centuries," she explained to the small group gathered around her table. "The husks were a byproduct of preparing corn for winter storage, so the dolls cost nothing to make. Traditionally, they don't have faces. It was believed that a doll with a face might come to life." She showed them how to soak the husks to make them pliable, how to tie them with corn silk to create the body and limbs, and how to dress the dolls in scraps of fabric. Her hands moved with the memory of decades of practice, and soon a perfect little doll emerged from what had looked like dried refuse. "Would you like to try?" she asked, and both Sarah and David found themselves sitting at the table, working with the husks under Mrs. Henderson's patient guidance. It was surprisingly meditative work, requiring focus and patience, and the satisfaction of creating something with their hands was immediate and profound. By mid-afternoon, they were ready for the walk that the train conductor had mentioned. The trail started behind the Heritage House, marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Whispering Falls Trail, 1.5 miles." The path led through a mixed forest of maple, oak, and pine, with occasional clearings that offered glimpses of the surrounding hills. The trail was well maintained, but not overly developed, just wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with wooden bridges over the small streams that crossed their path. The forest was alive with the sounds of late summer, birds calling from the canopy, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the distant sound of falling water that grew louder as they walked. "Listen," Sarah said, just stopping to focus on the sounds around them. No cars, no sirens, no construction noise, just nature. The forest smelled of rich earth and decomposing leaves, with occasional wafts of something sweet when they passed wild raspberries or the last of the summer wildflowers. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor, and the air was noticeably cooler under the trees. They walked in comfortable silence for long stretches, both lost in their own thoughts, but deeply aware of each other's presence. Occasionally, Sarah would stop to examine a particularly interesting mushroom or unusual flower, while David was drawn to the bird calls and the way the light played through the leaves. The waterfall, when they finally reached it, was not dramatic in the way of mountain cataracts, but perfect in its own gentle way. Water cascaded about 20 feet down a series of moss-covered rocks into a clear pool, surrounded by ferns and wildflowers. The sound was exactly what its name suggested, a whisper rather than a roar, but constant and soothing. They found a flat rock beside the pool and sat down to rest, listening to the water and watching the play of light on the surface of the pool. A few small fish moved in the shadows, and water striders dimpled the surface tension as they skated across the water. "I could sit here for hours," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook to sketch the scene. "There's something about moving water that just settles the mind, doesn't it?" David nodded, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his hands. "It's like meditation without trying. The sound just washes away all the noise in your head." They sat by the falls for nearly an hour, talking occasionally, but mostly just being present with the place and each other. Sarah sketched and wrote, while David simply watched and listened. The stress of their daily lives seemed to dissolve in the sound of the water, replaced by a deep sense of peace and connection. The walk back to town took them through different parts of the forest, as the trail formed a loop rather than simply retracing their steps. This section led through a grove of ancient oak trees, their massive trunks bearing the scars and growth patterns of centuries. Some of the trees were so large that it would have taken several people holding hands to encircle them. "Imagine the history these trees have seen," Sarah said, placing her hand on the bark of a particularly massive oak. "They were here when the town was founded, probably before the first European settlers arrived." As they emerged from the forest, the town spread out below them, looking like something from a postcard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets, and smoke rose from several chimneys. The mill wheel continued its steady turning, and they could see people moving about their daily business with the unhurried pace that seemed to characterize everything in Millbrook. Back in town, they decided to stop at the bakery they'd noticed earlier, drawn by the scent of fresh bread that had been tempting them all day. The bakery was a small storefront with a hand-painted sign and windows that displayed an array of breads, pastries, and cakes that looked like they belonged in a European village. The baker, a woman with flour-dusted apron and arms strong from years of kneading dough, was just pulling a batch of sourdough loaves from the oven. The crust was golden and crispy, and the bread made soft crackling sounds as it cooled. "The starter for this bread is over 50 years old," she explained, wrapping a loaf for them in brown paper. "It was given to me by the woman who taught me to bake, and she got it from her grandmother. It's part of the town's history, in a way." They also bought some cookies made with local honey and walnuts, and a fruit tart topped with peaches and berries from the morning's market. The bakery was clearly a gathering place. Several local residents were sitting at the small tables, drinking coffee and catching up on the day's news. "Are you folks visiting from the city?" asked an elderly man at the next table. And when they nodded, he smiled. "Hope you've had a good day. We're proud of our little town." "It's been wonderful," Sarah said sincerely. "Everyone has been so welcoming." "That's the Millbrook way," the man said. "We know we've got something special here, and we like to share it." As evening approached, they made their way to a small restaurant that had been recommended by several people throughout the day. The harvest table was housed in a converted farmhouse, with dining rooms that retained the cozy feeling of a family home. The menu featured local ingredients prepared with care and creativity, dishes that honored traditional techniques while adding modern touches. They started with a salad made from greens grown in the restaurant's own garden, dressed with vinegar made from local apples and oil pressed from sunflower seeds grown in the next county. The flavors were clean and bright, tasting of the earth and the season. The main course was a revelation: slow-cooked pork from a nearby farm, served with vegetables that had been harvested that morning and grains that had been ground at the mill they'd visited. Everything on the plate had a story, a connection to the land and the community. "This is what food should be," David said, savoring a bite of the perfectly cooked pork. You can taste the care that went into every ingredient. For dessert, they shared a slice of apple pie made with fruit from the Heritage House orchard, the crust flaky and buttery, the filling sweet and spiced with cinnamon grown in the museum's herb garden. It was served with cream that had been churned that morning, rich and slightly sweet. As they ate, the sun set through the restaurant's windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The dining room filled with the warm glow of candles and the gentle murmur of conversation. Other diners were clearly a mix of locals and visitors, all enjoying the unhurried pace and the quality of the food. "I don't want this day to end," Sarah said, looking around the cozy dining room. "It feels like we've discovered something precious." "We have," David agreed. "This whole place, this whole day, it's like a reminder of what really matters. Good food, beautiful places, genuine people, time to actually experience things instead of just rushing through them." After dinner, they walked slowly back through the town, taking their time to notice details they might have missed earlier. The streetlights were old-fashioned lanterns that cast a warm glow, and many of the houses had front porches where people sat in rockers, waving to passers-by. The sound of their footsteps on the sidewalk mingled with the distant sound of the mill wheel and the gentle evening sounds of a small town settling into night. They stopped at the gazebo in the town square, where a few other people were also enjoying the evening air. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and the air carried a scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the last flowers of the season. "Look at the stars," David said, pointing upward. Away from the city lights, the sky was brilliant with stars, more than they ever saw at home. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and the constellations were clear and bright. "It's amazing how much you can see when there's no light pollution," Sarah said, tilting her head back to take in the full display. "I'd forgotten how beautiful the night sky can be." They sat in the gazebo for a while, watching the stars and listening to the peaceful sounds of the town at night. A few cars passed by, but slowly and quietly, their drivers clearly in no hurry. Dogs barked occasionally in the distance, and somewhere a screen door creaked open and closed. "We should come back," Sarah said finally. "Maybe in the fall when the leaves are changing, or in the winter when everything is covered in snow." "Definitely," David agreed. "I think we've found our refuge." As they made their way back to the train station, they passed the closed shops and restaurants, their windows dark but welcoming. The mill wheel continued its steady turning, and the creek gurgled softly in the darkness. Everything felt peaceful and complete, as if the town itself were settling into a contented sleep. The evening train was waiting at the station, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. As they climbed aboard and found their seats, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction and renewal. The day had been exactly what she hadn't known she needed, a reminder of simplicity, community, and the deep pleasure of experiencing a place fully and without hurry. As the train pulled away from the station, they watched the lights of Millbrook fade into the distance, but the feeling of peace and connection remained. The rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks was even more soothing now, a gentle lullaby that seemed to carry them not just back to the city, but back to themselves. "Thank you for suggesting this," David said, settling into his seat with a contented sigh. "I feel like we've been on vacation for a week instead of just a day." Sarah smiled, already making notes in her journal about the day's experiences. "It's amazing how much you can fit into a day when you're not rushing. We saw more, learned more, experienced more than we do in most weeks at home." The train rocked gently as it picked up speed, and the countryside flew by in the darkness. Inside the warm, lit car, passengers were settling in for the journey home, many of them looking as peaceful and satisfied as Sarah felt. The day trippers from Millbrook seemed to share a special satisfaction, as if they had all been part of something special. As Sarah leaned back in her seat, watching the stars through the window and listening to the rhythmic sound of the train, she felt deeply grateful for the day's experiences. The taste of fresh bread and ripe peaches, the sound of the waterfall, the feel of corn husks transforming into art under her hands, the warmth of genuine hospitality. All of it had combined to create something more valuable than any expensive vacation. The cornhusk doll she had made sat in her lap, faceless but somehow full of character, a tangible reminder of the day's discoveries. In her bag were the honey and apple butter, the fresh flour and cornmeal, the wildflower bouquet that would grace their table for the next few days. But the real souvenirs were invisible, the renewed sense of what mattered, the deep relaxation that came from moving at a human pace, the connection to the land and the seasons that modern life too often obscured. As the train carried them through the night toward home, Sarah closed her eyes and let the gentle motion and rhythmic sounds lull her into a state of deep contentment. The day had been a gift, a reminder that beauty and meaning were always there, waiting to be discovered, in the simple pleasures of good food, beautiful places, and genuine human connection. The last thing she remembered before drifting off to sleep was the sound of the mill wheel turning, steady and peaceful, like a heartbeat that would continue long after they were gone, marking time in a place where time itself seemed to move more gently, more purposefully, more kindly than anywhere else she had ever been. The end.